Dealey sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the clock on the wall. His fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of the chair. His wife had still not been back home from work, leaving him alone with their twin daughters, Amina and Aisha. Dealey's mind raced with suspicion. For weeks, he had noticed Bola's odd behavior, late nights, hushed phone calls, and a distant demeanor. His trust in her began to fade. The time was 11 o'clock p.m., and she was not yet back. What kind of job keeps someone late till this time? She's a married woman, for Christ's sake. Is she cheating on me? He muttered under his breath. The thought consumed him until he decided to take action. A week earlier, he had plucked a few strands of Amina and Aisha's hair and sent them off for a DNA test. He needed to know the truth. When the results arrived, Dealey's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The words on the report sent a wave of anger through him. Not a biological match. They're not mine, Dealey whispered, his voice trembling with fury. After everything I've done for her, for them. He clenched the paper in his fist, his mind spiraling into darkness. Bola had betrayed him, and he vowed to make her pay. But he wouldn't start with her. He would start with the twins. It was a quiet night when Dealey first entered the twins' room. Amina and Aisha were fast asleep, their breaths even and peaceful. Dealey stood by the door for a moment, his face cold. Then he stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "Wake up," he whispered, as he tapped both of them. Amina stirred first, blinking up at him in confusion. "Daddy, what's wrong?" "Shut up and listen," Dealey snapped, his voice low and threatening. "If either of you say a word about this, I'll kill you both. Do you hear me?" Amina and Aisha exchanged terrified glances, their small bodies trembling. They didn't understand why their father was acting this way, but the menace in his tone silenced them. He pinned them one by one to the bed as he assaulted them. "Dad, please stop. It's painful," they cried, with tears in their eyes. Dealey's visits became a nightmare, repeated each night Bola was away. Amina and Aisha would lie awake, hoping he would stop coming to abuse them. One evening, after Dealey had left their room, Amina sat up in bed, her face streaked with tears. She looked at her sister, who was curled up at the edge of the bed, crying quietly. "We can't let this keep happen," Amina whispered. "What can we do?" Aisha replied, her voice shaking. "He said he'd kill us." Amina's jaw tightened. "We need to record him. We need proof. Maybe Mom will believe us if we show her." She checked through her mother's drawer the next day and found an old phone. That night, when Dealey came into their room, Amina secretly pressed record, capturing the horrifying sounds of what they went through in the hands of their father. The twins endured days of torment before Amina finally decided enough was enough. One morning, after Dealey had gone to work, she turned to Aisha. "We're telling Mama today," she said firmly. Aisha hesitated, fear written all over her face. "What if he finds out? What if he hurts us? We can't stay silent anymore," Amina insisted. When Bola returned from her night shift, she found her daughters waiting for her in the living room. "Mama, we need to talk," Amina said, her voice trembling. Bola frowned, setting her bag down. "What is it, my babies? You look so serious." Aisha burst into tears, and Amina held her hand tightly. "Mama, it's Dad," Amina began. He's been coming into our room at night." Bola's heart sank as she listened to her daughters recount the horrors they had endured. Tears streamed down her face as Amina played the recordings. The muffled cries and Dealey's threatening voice were undeniable. No, this can't be," Bola whispered, covering her mouth in shock. That evening, Bola waited for Dealey to come home. The moment he walked through the door, she confronted him, her face red with anger. "Dealey, how could you?" she screamed, shoving the phone with the recordings into his face. Dealey glanced at the screen and then at Bola, his expression unreadable. "You want to know why I did it?" he said, his voice calm but icy. "Because they're not mine, Bola. They aren't mine, and you know it." "How could you, Bola? How could you? You have been lying to me all this while. I have been raising another man's kids for the past 12 years. only for me to discover a few weeks ago that your kids aren't mine. You used me, Bola, Dealey said angrily. Bola froze, her anger replaced by confusion. What are you talking about? Dealey pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his briefcase and threw it at her. Read it. Those girls aren't mine. You cheated on me and you freaking know it. Bola stared at the DNA results, her hands trembling. Dealey, please let me explain. I did it for us. I was left with no other option. For us? What do you mean? You opened your legs for another man. Yet you said it's for us. I did everything just to make you happy, Bola. This is how you repay me. Dealey said angrily. We were going through tough times years back. You lost your job, and I had just graduated from school, in search of a job. Your friend Alex offered to help. He said he would sleep with me before giving me a job at the bank. I had no other choice, so I did it. Till today, I've lived with the guilt of what I did. Please find a place in your hearts to forgive me. It will never happen again, I promise, Bola pleaded, crying. That's not an excuse for cheating on me. You are my wife, and I trusted you with everything, but you betrayed my trust. I'm done with you. And as for Alex, I'll pay that fool a visit tonight, Dealey said as he dropped his bag and left home. Immediately, that night, Dealey drove out to visit his friend Jide, who betrayed him. He took a pistol with him. Dealey parked his car in front of Jide's luxurious house, his heart pounding like a war drum. The pistol in his pocket felt heavy, but not heavier than the betrayal he carried in his chest. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his shirt, and walked up to the door. Jide opened it, his face lighting up with a smile. Dealey, my man, what's up? What brings you here at this time of the night? Dealey forced a tight smile. I just needed to talk to you, Jide. Man too. Man, of course. Come in, Jide said, stepping aside. Dealey entered the house, his eyes scanning the room. Everything about Jide's life screamed wealth. An expensive leather couch, a massive TV, and a shelf filled with rare liquors. Jide gestured toward the couch. Have a seat. Let me grab us a drink, Jide said, heading to the bar. Dealey sat down, his hands gripping his knees. Moments later, Jide returned with 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Dealey. So, what's on your mind? Jide asked, taking a sip. Dealey stared at the amber liquid in his glass. You and I, we've been best friends since secondary school, right? Jide smiled, leaning back. Of course, you're like a brother to me. We've been through thick and thin together. Dealey nodded slowly, setting his glass down on the table. Exactly. That's why I trusted you. Why I never thought you'd betray me. Jide froze, his smile fading. Betray you? Dealey, what are you talking about? Dealey reached into his pocket and pulled out the pistol, placing it on the table. The metallic sound echoed through the room, making Jide flinch. What the hell, Dealey? Jide stammered, raising his hand slightly. I'm going to ask you one question, Dealey said, his voice low and menacing. And God help you if you lie to me. Jide's eyes darted to the gun and back to Dealey. Man, this some kind of joke? What are you talking about? Dealey leaned forward, his hand resting on the gun. Did you sleep with my wife years ago before offering her a job at the bank? Yes or no? Jide's face turned pale. Dealey, listen, yes or no? Dealey roared, slamming his hand on the table. Jide gulped, his voice barely a whisper. Yes. But it's not what you think. Before Jide could finish, Dealey pulled the trigger. Jide slumped back in his chair, blood pooling around him. Dealey sat there for a moment, breathing heavily as he placed the gun back on the table. After a few minutes, Dealey stood up, wiping his face with his hand. He walked to the door, pausing to look back at the mess he'd created. The morning after Dealey killed Jide, he sat in his living room, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. He tried to bury his guilt deep down, convincing himself that Jide deserved what he got. But his peace didn't last long. Around 10 o'clock a.m., a loud knock came at the door. Who's that? Dealey muttered, rising from his chair. He opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there, their faces stern. Good morning. Are you Mr. Dealey Adamu? One of the officers asked. Yes, Dealey replied. You're under arrest for the murder of Mr. Jide Badeo, the officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Dealey froze. What murder? I don't know what you're talking about. We have evidence linking you to the crime. Please come with us, the officer said firmly. Before Dealey could argue, the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His neighbors peeked through their windows as he was led to the police car. At the station, Dealey sat in the interrogation room, his head in his hands. A detective entered, dropping a file on the table. Mr. Adamu, we know you were at Jide's house last night. Witnesses saw your car parked outside, and we found your fingerprints on the murder weapon. Do you have anything to say? Dealey's mind raced. He deserved it, he muttered under his breath. What did you say? The detective pressed. Dealey looked up, his eyes filled with anger. He slept with my wife. He betrayed me. I did what any man would do. The detective sighed. You're confessing to murder, Mr. Adamu. This will only make things worse for you. At home, Bola was pacing the living room. Amina and Aisha sat on the couch, their faces pale. Mama, do you think the police will believe us? Aisha asked, her voice trembling. They have to, Bola said, holding up the phone with the recordings. No one will hurt you ever again, not even your father. Hours later, 2 police officers arrived at the house. Bola handed over the phone and explained everything. Thank you for coming forward, Mrs. Adamu, one officer said. This evidence is enough to charge him with another crime. That evening, Dealey sat in his prison cell, his head bowed. A guard approached, unlocking the door. You have a visitor, the guard said. Dealey looked up in surprise as Bola stepped into the visitation room. What are you doing here? Dealey asked coldly. Bola stared at him, her eyes filled with fury. I wanted to see the face of the man who hurt my daughters. Dealey's expression darkened. They're not even my daughters, Bola. You betrayed me first. That doesn't justify what you did. Bola shouted. They are children, Dealey. Your hatred for me destroyed their lives. So, what now? You're here to gloat? No, Bola said firmly. I'm here to tell you that I'm divorcing you. I've already started the process, and you'll never see Amina or Aisha again. I don't care. You can keep them to yourself, Dealey said. About 2 months later, Dealey stood trial for the murder of his friend Jide and the repeated sexual assault of his twin daughters. In a packed courtroom, the judge declared him guilty of both crimes. For Jide's murder, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and for the abuse of his daughters, he received an additional 300 years in prison. The sentences were to run consecutively, ensuring Dealey would spend the rest of his life behind bars. His wife, Bola, sat quietly unfazed in the courtroom, knowing justice had been served for her daughters. If you were the one, what would you have done differently? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my story. I want to read from you. Where are you watching from? And how does this story resonate with you? What do you think about this story? Comment below, share, and like this video. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye for now.